You might think that racing and the looter-shooter genre don't have a lot in common, and you'd be wrong about that. You want loot, you want it fast, some mission types are pretty linear, bam, you got yourself a racetrack. Lots of missions already become informal races through some unspoken mutual awareness in public squads, and I bet some of you have perhaps unknowingly done this already, so I've created a simple competitive free-for-all racing format that isn't that different from normal gameplay. You jump into a capture mission, use an energy pad to fuel up and signal your 3, 2, 1, go, and you're off. Whoever captures the target gets a point, and the first one to get to extraction gets another point. Best of 3, best of 5, up to you. Sometimes capture missions become exterminates after the cap, and in that case the cap is worth double and extraction is worth nothing, and simultaneous captures are possible and give points to everyone capturing. There you go, now get out there and, well, I guess I have a little bit more to say about it. Instead of just showing you a tier list, I was thinking that I'd show racing builds for every single relevant racing frame in the entire game all in one video. Does that sound good to you? What a coincidence. Behold, my updated DriftFrame racing tier list. I have some contextual information for you while you take a good look at where everybody is. So take your time and I'll set things up. I'm going to demonstrate everything there is to demonstrate, starting from the bottom and moving up, and I'll also discuss differences from my previous tier list as we get to them. Speaking of that previous version, this time around I'll be handling updates much more fluidly. If you're from the future and a new frame has been released, but I haven't yet made a full updated tier list that includes that frame, you'll find that I've made a smaller video dedicated to racing with that new frame in my DriftFrame playlist, which I'll keep up to date and which I've attached for your convenience, complete with some supplementary materials. Let's see what else. So we use capture missions because they never have friendship doors or elevators. That way you can freely chase the target, or for our purposes, blaze right through the entire mission. The only exception is the Kuva Fortress capture mission, so I would avoid that one. Otherwise, you can pick any capture mission you choose, and I'd recommend varying your track selections. Next up, open world racing sounds cool, but is somewhat more problematic because there aren't enough obstacles. Generally, it's just a matter of which frame with which build is the fastest in an open space, and your skill has nothing to do with it, so it's not a good contest. But how bad that problem is varies by environment. For example, at the time of this recording, the Plains of Eidolon doesn't have many caves that you can pass through, like part of a track. Most of them have a single entrance, but the Orb Valis does have quite a few more caves that could be used as throughways, so it may be possible to route a good competitive track through those. The concern is that there would still be too much open space, and it would come down to just spamming the fastest ability with the fastest build with no room to outplay people. So we aren't giving up on open world racing. Those open spaces might cause people to run out of gas, which we'll get to in a sec, so that could be a balancing factor. Again, there are some problems to solve. So then I want to clarify the exact parameters. So you can't use gear items like energy plates. You only get one large squad energy restore at the start of the race, which gives you 400 energy in 4 pulses. You can't use operators in any way, whether for movement or other abilities, so you are stuck with that 400 energy, and I suppose any you pick up from enemies you kill during the race. Since no current frame can hold 400 energy unmodded, you might choose to use your abilities early during the energy plate countdown to get the most out of the energy you can hold. This is your gas tank, and it becomes important on longer tracks. Again, it might even make us able to finagle some kind of open world racing that's competitive, because even if people have the fastest ability that they can just spam and it requires no skill to win, if they run out of energy, then maybe you'd have time to catch up. So who knows? There are a few other things to note, but I bet you want to get into it, and I do too, so I'll elaborate on things like prime frame variants, operators and Nova being banned, and arcane helmets, where they come up along the way. And now with all of that in mind, I'll start with F tier. We're starting off pretty slow. We've got Hildryn, Inaros, Frost, Harrow, Mag, Oberon, Wukong, and Nidus. These frames have neutral or slower sprint speed and no speedy movement abilities, so they aren't relevant for racing. Hildryn and Wukong can literally fly, but not very fast. As I alluded to earlier, prime variants of these frames also don't happen to gain any sprint speed, so they don't make a difference for racing, but one thing I find interesting about this tier list overall is that a frame's viability for racing has very little relation to their perceived or actual usefulness in normal gameplay. These F-tier racers are mostly powerful frames that we use all the time. So that's it for F-tier, and that means we can get into the real speeds, sort of. D-tier is our largest tier, and I'm going to split it into 2 parts. Some of these frames have rudimentary movement tech, while others simply have higher than average sprint speed. This also feels like a good time to mention that I'll be demonstrating everyone with an Amalgam Serration and the Tellus Boltace equipped. So that's a passive 25% sprint speed and 20% parkour velocity, that's the Telos Boltace's hidden passive, for everyone. And incidentally, you also get some good access to Dispatch Overdrive for now. The existence of these racing stats in weapons makes everyone faster passively, so the relative power of any kind of movement speed advantage goes down slightly in their presence. If you want to learn more about racing weapons, I've attached separate videos about them. Some arcanes are also relevant to racing, but right now the most relevant one is Arcane Consequence, and you'll forgive me if I don't get a headshot every 12 seconds for the rest of this video. There won't always be enemies around to proc this off, and tons of bullet jump velocity isn't always the best way to get around certain obstacles anyway. Sometimes you want to make a controlled movement up or down, and then it's not as good to go further. So even though lots of people will run double consequence on every racing loadout, your speed without them does matter. Okay, and starting with Ivara, we get to break the rules by running double Amalgam Serrations. And she can also do this zipline slingshot thing, which is really, really fast, but a little bit janky to set up in the middle. Wow, the momentum really carries. Yes, right, it's a little bit janky to set up in the middle of a race. You also only get the second Amalgam Serration while Artemis Bow is out, which isn't true of the first one. You don't have to have your primary equipped to get the sprint speed, the same way you don't have to have Telos Boltace equipped to get the parkour velocity. But you do have to have Artemis Bow out to get the second Amalgam Serration effect. That's kind of weird, but not as big a deal, except for clearing enemies out of the way. Well, and for triggering Arcane Consequence. Bows are not the easiest weapons to land flyby headshots with. But at least at the beginning of the race, you can set up this crazy slingshot tech that uses Infiltrate, so the speed bonus on Ivara's Infiltrate augment is affected by strength. And normally you can't sprint while you're in Prowl, but sprinting on a dash wire doesn't break Prowl, leading to, as you saw, some of the more impressive speed in the game. As long as you're on a dash wire, you can. And dash wires do have some utility for traversing awkward environments, but they're mostly impractical in the middle of a race. And this is a small detail, but slide mods don't really work well on dash wires. Dash wire sliding is just not, you can, but it just doesn't work so well. You don't really get more velocity like you sometimes can. So that does slow down your potential maximum speed. And that's part of why I moved Ivara down a tier. Well, not the sliding thing, but the dash wire tech being janky. Despite the fact that she got that Amalgam Serration doubling, I realized just how janky the zipline thing is. It's just about impossible to set that up in a timely manner during a race. And most of the time it's not really faster than just running, and you're kind of fast, you know, unless you do have a huge open space. Again, it's the kind of thing that when it's good, it's going to be really good, but like how often is it really going to be? But I mean, you can still... All of this leaves Ivara with a lot of impressive but situational tech that doesn't get her out of D tier as much as just look much cooler than the rest of the frames keeping her company there. Frames such as Vauban. Vauban has his bounces, and they can kind of interfere with people. I think Vauban's tech here is mostly useful if you are ahead. You could be, you know, bullet jumping ahead of people, minding your own business, and then just pop some bounces behind you, or I guess you could do them like as you're moving, yeah. And then you go over them, they don't interfere with you. And then in little choke points, you know, you got a couple of bounces in there. And people are going to have a bad time, you know, that will slow them down, sure. The problem is that Vauban isn't going to be ahead because he's not fast for any other reason. You can actually use the bounces to make yourself go a little bit faster, so they'll deploy such that their pushing force is away from whatever surface they're on. So boop, that consistently pushes you away from this thing. Boop, that pushes you away from the ground, you get the idea. So theoretically, you can use them to go faster, but because you have to be sort of around the thing you want to use to boost. So you see, if I wanted to go this way, let's see if I want to go that way, right? So if I put one here, it's going to push me back. So I need to be past where I want to go, and then put it down here, and then go backward, and then go forward, which is obviously not faster in a race. At the beginning of the race, you're seeing the similarities to Ivara now. You could set this up and slingshot yourself forward. You can get a lot of them going, but you don't go faster infinitely. I thought that maybe you could use this to really railgun yourself out of there, but not exactly, so I'll put down a bunch. And you'll see that I don't go crazy fast. I just go certainly faster than just one of them, but not that fast. You know, it's not that impressive. So Vauban's real utility would lie in his ability to sabotage opponents, which is something very few frames can do, although there are a few people that are better at it than he is in the tier list. But yeah, like going fast is not really a thing that Vauban is very good at, and I definitely think that in the context of what we just saw Ivara capable of doing, he might seem kind of slow, but interfering with other people is totally a thing, and if you have the means to get ahead of your opponents, Vauban could actually be fairly strong if you deploy these bounces at really unpleasant points on the track. So who knows, but clearly not that great. Again, we aren't exactly Speed Racer yet. This is all still jank, but it's something. He has something. Atlas has his lock-on punches. You go straight when you use landslide on someone, and there's minimal animation afterward, but the range is not that high, so this is with max range. I'm spamming, I can't hit there, can't hit there, can't hit there. We're gonna go around. I can go there, okay, that's nice. You can do that. And you can kind of use it to snipe doorways and air strafe around a little bit. If you're flying, you know, past, you want to go over there, there's a doorway there, but you have to run this way. You can go boom and then, you know, dive down like that if there's an enemy there. But the range is so short, even with max range, that it's just not that good. This is also with max, or at least some efficiency, which is something you're going to need. Keep in mind that you only get one energy pad worth of energy at the start of the race, and you can't use more energy pads or operator abilities to fuel you back up. So even if enemies were perfectly positioned throughout the track, you might just run out of gas, even with this build. Although Atlas does get a discount on consecutive punches if you do it within a certain combo window that is moddable, but it is affected by duration, so if you mod for efficiency, then anyway, there you go. And you also lose all that space for speed in exchange for really not even that much speed. So again, Atlas does have some movement tech, but it's not very good. Garuda has a similar situation, so she has her first and second abilities, which both allow you to jump to nearby enemies, kind of like Atlas's punches. And the range with Garuda's is really impressive. It's like that. This is max range, but it's really far, you know? There are two problems with Garuda's movement. First of all, again, you risk running out of gas. And second of all, both of these abilities that let you move around, so this one, and then you also have your second ability, they both kind of have their own drawbacks. So you can see that the first ability, this is really fast, but you kind of go backwards first. You saw that I actually spent a lot of time, a meaningful half a second, moving literally backwards away from where I wanted to go. And if you use the second ability, you don't move backwards, you move real fast. But there's a long animation lock, so I'm going to try to move as fast as possible after using it. And I ran out of energy, but you can use bloodletting, so that's something. But it's, you know, you might actually die if you do that too much in a race. So I'm going to try to move as soon as possible. I can't move, I can't move, I can't move. There we go. So see, it keeps you stuck for a while. So even though you can jump a huge, truly gigantic distance with Garuda's 1 and 2, it does, you know, have the drawback that you're not going to be able to move immediately. So it's not great. Again, it's not bad. I feel like this is better than what Atlas has, and it's definitely a lot more useful for that thing I was talking about, where if you're going by a doorway or there's an opening in the ground and you want to air strafe somewhere else, you can use this to do that. But you can also use melee slams to do that. Like if you're going this way, you can do a directional slam, you know. That's kind of the same thing as being able to do this, but it certainly looks really cool, and it's fast. Like if you get lucky with enemy spawn places, maybe you're gonna go fairly fast. Yeah. You know, it's not that fast. Chroma's fourth ability increases your speed, but the bonus isn't affected by strength, and it's not that powerful. It's just not a very fast bonus. This is with no mods of any kind, and you can see how quickly it drains my energy and how comparatively not that much faster I go. So let's put it back on and see how much slower we go. So it's a noticeable speed increase, sure, but it's definitely nothing to write home about, and again, it's not increasable with strength, so just a very small bonus. Again, effectively, this is just Chroma having higher than average sprint speed, except it's a little bit worse because your sprint speed actually gets multiplied by these values rather than having them just added to it. So if Chroma's sprint speed was naturally this high, he would actually be a little bit faster because Amalgam Serration and other multipliers would make him go even further. It would just be 25%. He'd get 25% of 1 point whatever speed. So actually having it as a buff that is not affected by strength is basically just worse natural sprint speed, again, which is not that great. Chroma also gets an animation lock when his pelt comes back to him, so if you're running on empty and you don't make sure you're parkouring or something to mitigate the animation lock, it slows you down a lot. You see there it was fine, but let's say that I didn't plan for it and that hits me. You see I can't move while I'm doing that. So Chroma's not too fast. Speaking of natural run speed, Limbo is just a little bit faster than average. His special dash, this looks kind of fast, but it actually isn't. It's the same as a normal dash, which is not all that great. You know, usable just like a normal dash, but just not all that fast. His sprint speed is all right. You know, he gets going pretty quick. You can see with no special movement speed mods. He's like around as fast as Chroma was with his pelt off, maybe a little slower. Much like Ember, Trinity, Khora, Nekros, Gara, Baruuk, Banshee, and Mesa. And these higher base sprint speeds do sort of matter because some higher tier frames will have speed buffs that you can benefit from if you get close enough. Usually the frames pushing those speed buffs don't themselves have high base sprint speed, so if you can get their buff, all things being equal, you'll be significantly faster. This is Baruuk with all the slide mods and all the sprint mods, and you can see that when I slide a little bit, I have so much forward momentum that I don't even need to jump over these gaps. Well, okay, so just to give you some idea of where we are in the tier list, that is the kind of speed that you can get with good base sprint speed, but literally no movement tech whatsoever if you have these mods. And yeah, you could snag a speed buff, but relying on your opponents to be bad and make you fast isn't really the best strategy. So that's D tier, some weird tech movement abilities and some pretty nice sprint speeds that can actually get you going pretty quick, but that's about it. And with that, we've arrived at C tier, and now we're talking. Quite a diverse roster of movement styles to break down, including a new approach, starting with Nyx, who has innate parkour velocity increases to supplement the Telos Voltes and potentially bullet jump mods or Arcane Consequence procs. A few frames that we'll get to shortly have this as a passive thing, while Nyx has it on her Arcane Helmet, which is basically a very old and now discontinued type of cosmetic that also has some stats on it. Nyx's here gives her around 25% parkour velocity, and like all Arcane Helmets, it takes up one of your frame's Arcane slots. As you can see, this one is locked. Usually that means what you're sacrificing is slightly higher bullet jump velocity from another Arcane Consequence in exchange for having that velocity all the time, which is usually a good trade-off but makes it less good than it might otherwise be, and puts Mirage solidly ahead in that regard, since she has the same passive velocity without using an Arcane slot to get it. So you can see how high you can go with just the Arcane Helmet and Telos Voltes. It's pretty strong. You have over 50% bullet jump velocity just passively, so more than an Arcane Consequence without ever needing to activate it. And this is without a bullet jump mod, and again, potentially Arcane Consequences as well. You could get some pretty seriously fast bullet jumps, and you can go really high if that's what you're looking for. Not always the best way to move around, but definitely an option. The reason that Nyx is so important for the discussion about Arcane Helmets is that she's the only frame for which I change my ranking depending on whether you have her Arcane Helmet or not. With it, she's basically Mirage, and without it, she'd be in D tier with some decent base sprint speed. Ultimately, I opted to put Nyx up a tier instead of down one here. I decided to include Arcane Helmets this time because neither Nyx nor Rhino, the two frames that are influenced by the inclusion, are that good in the first place with or without them. So even though practically nobody has the helmets, and at least in Rhino's case, his is comically expensive and not at all worth it, I figure that the few people that do have the Arcane Helmets for them will be the people who want to race with them. So it ultimately doesn't make a ton of sense to ignore them. And what seals the deal for me is that it doesn't really matter anyway. They still aren't that fast. Again, this is a tier list. It's just for fun. Its job is to inspire you. And my philosophy has changed a bit since the last tier list. The current me figures I might as well include them. Shout out to my future self who may disagree at some point. Rhino has his charge and is also Arcane Helmet footnote number 2. His gives him 25% speed directly. So you can see that with it on, I'm going to get a nice chunky speed increase, which is actually not shown in the UI. But you'll see I'll move faster. So this is with no speed mods on, no sprint speed mods on. Rhino is pretty slow without this, so it brings him up to a little bit faster instead of pretty slow, which again, that's just really not enough to move you up or down at this point. His dashes, which we'll demonstrate in a sec, are already enough to get you into C tier, and at this point, a little bit of speed like this isn't enough to move you up or down a tier on its own, but it's still something that you'd want to have anyway if you were going to play Rhino, if it weren't like 450 platinum on PC at the time of this recording. Anyway, overall, Rhino is pretty balanced. Let me switch back to the fashion I actually enjoy. His dashes don't require a target and plow through enemies on their way. That's good, but they can only move laterally. You can't dash up or down. You see there I went sideways even though I was looking up. Rhino is pretty questionable as a runner without his Arcane Helmet, but his dashes are a thing, at least with some range. Although that does take up space that you could use to get other speed mods going. I still moved Rhino down a tier despite the fact that I'm now including his Arcane Helmet because his dashes are really a lot weaker than I gave them credit for, and they're very clumsy, they're not very smooth. Dashes in general were overvalued in the last tier list, and you'll see that influencing my rankings for a few other frames. I think that Excalibur probably should have been A tier in the context of the last tier list, but again, overvalued dashes across the board a bit. Speaking of dashes, Revenant, like Rhino, also has a dash that doesn't require a target and plows through enemies, and Revenant is the only frame with a steerable dash. His isn't that fast, but has a great cornering advantage. It's really, really good at turning. That's not his dash, but we'll get to that in a sec. As you can see, you can direct the cursor and fly around like this. Now, you lose control if you're not on the ground, so if I go over terrain like that, you see I can pass over it because I'm moving fast enough, but you do briefly lose control. So on uneven ground, Revenant is a lot less stable, but this is fairly fast. You see here I can't turn in the air. Then when I get it down here, it makes a pretty smooth transition overall, and this is also something that goes around terrain pretty nicely as long as you don't point straight at it. So it's not bad, definitely something alright, and it doesn't take a ton of modding space to make it good. So Revenant's dash is based on duration. There's nothing you can do to make it faster, you can just make it last longer, so you can get it up to about 300%, and then you get 3 seconds of dashing, which is, again, like not the most exciting thing in the world, but it's not bad, and again, it's fairly fast. You are invulnerable while you do this, which is something. The major advantage, again, is that Revenant doesn't have momentum while in his dash, and you have perfect steering. You move at a set speed, and you can just freely steer yourself. You can go in a circle if you would ever want to do that for some reason. But the major disadvantage is that you don't gain momentum while in his dash. There are a lot of frames that want to use their dash in a big open area, and you want to have some momentum coming out of it, and Revenant doesn't really gain any. It would be cool if you kept this amount of speed when you got out, then you could maybe jump at the end, and you would kind of maintain that momentum, but you could hear me pressing, and I can't jump right at the end, and you do come to a stop once you're done. There is even that tiny aftercast, so not the greatest thing in the world, and again, you lose the ability to steer if you go over terrain, the uneven terrain, and you suffer a large animation lock at the end. Okay, so there are several problems, but Revenant is also basically unkillable in the context of racing, with very little mod investment thanks to his second ability. Dying isn't a huge deal in the quick little jaunts that we do for races, but it's a small advantage. He's tanky. Equinox, our first speed booster, affected by strength. Shifting to day form provides a speed increase that scales with your strength. It's got a long duration and a very low cost as being a first ability, but it's got a weak starting value of only 15%. Even with very high strength, again, you can see this is just not extremely fast, but it's very consistent, and you run no risk of giving opponents the buff, which is something we're going to have to get into pretty soon. That's pretty nice. Equinox also effectively demonstrates a problem we first saw on Ivara, which I mentioned a little earlier. You have to build strength and potentially other stats for your speed buff. I have a little bit of duration here, which we might not need. You can't run all of the other movement increasing mods that other frames can, which further secures their advantage if they snag someone else's speed buff, which again fortunately isn't a risk that Equinox has to keep in mind with her own buff. Ashe, the speed thief of the tier list. Ashe teleports behind people for infinite losing at incredibly high range, with very little casting delay. But as you can see, you lose your forward momentum when you teleport, so even if you're trying to catch up to someone and you're really close and you're almost there, and you pop off your teleport, you stop moving completely. So if they have forward momentum, they'll just pull right ahead again. So the main use of Ashe's teleport is to steal speed buffs from higher tier frames and get them for yourself. Because Ashe has such nice base sprint speed, one of the higher base sprint speeds in the game, just like Baruuk, and he will be superseded only by Loki, Ashe has the capability to make better use of a speed buff than the frame that is providing it. And because he doesn't have to build for it, he gets to use all his build space for stuff to go fast, whatever you want. You grab your bullet jump mod, grab your sprint speed, grab your, I don't put any friction mods in here, but backed up by very high base sprint speed and a skilled pilot, Ashe can potentially thrive off of Volt or Octavia, let's say, their speed buffs. If you get their buffs, you will be faster due to your higher base sprint speed and greater freedom to use all of your mod space for speed instead of powering up a speed buff. But unless you're really in someone's head and you can keep pace with them while they have their buff and you don't, you aren't likely to get buffs consistently. Usually the way that you can succeed here is that if someone is turning a corner, or perhaps they've gotten caught on something, but assuming the player is very good, when they're turning a corner or something, there will be moments where they can't just keep momentum for the entire race. And at that moment, if you teleport to them, you will stay caught up for a few seconds. If you can just stay on them for a little bit longer, you can either steal their speed buff when they're forced to recast, or potentially force them to not recast which I guess isn't going to make you win, but it would make them lose too. I think that most people are most likely to just recast the buff and take their chances that they can still beat you, but most of the time, math is going to give you faster speed than they are. You're also going to notice that I've chosen to use range in this build just to show you how far you can teleport, but the base range of Ashe's teleport is really, really long, so even if we just take these mods off, you can see it's still 60 meters. You really don't need the range, and you're not really faster than frames like Baruuk unless you run that slide. You want to slide a little bit every so often to maintain momentum. This is really critical because Ashe's success hinges on his ability to stay caught up, stay neck and neck with a frame that has a speed buff for a little bit, and you're gonna need the slide mods to do that most of the time. So just keep that in mind. The teleport range, like there will be situations where that will save you, but I would say overall it's probably not worth it, and I would go for the slide. Even if Ashe is not so strong in general against opponents that are really on their game, if you can get in someone's head, you do have a pretty good chance at winning, and teleporting is a strong thing. Occasionally, you can teleport to enemies or destructible crates, you can do that, and you will very rarely be able to get ahead that way as well. But again, this goes back to the thing we had with Atlas, and Garuda can basically teleport to enemies with her 1 and her 2. We didn't say that was very good, so you know. Ooh, Valkyr, one of my favorite troll picks. So Ripline provides good maneuverability in midair. It lets you kind of reposition yourself while you're flying around, and it lets you transition to the ground very smoothly. If you hit the ground like that, you smoothly glide into place and sort of float down, and you maintain and even gain a little momentum. That's not so great. It's kind of invalidated by directional melee slams, which move faster as far as I can tell, but do give you that little slam at the end. You can cancel that, but anyway, so that's maybe not the best use, but what you can do is use Ripline to pull allies backwards. Your opponents can be affected by Ripline, and you can pull them backwards. Now, this probably isn't going to make you win a race, because if I pull something in midair, you can see I kind of stay still. So if I'm going to try to drive by something, you know, you really whip it away, which is good, but you're probably not going to win the race yourself by doing that. You're not making yourself go any faster, but you can maintain some aim glide momentum like that. You know, it's not nothing. And you at least definitely aren't going to allow the person you grabbed to win. What's most likely going to happen is that a third person is going to pass both of you. But if you're really feeling the salt, you know, it's something you can do. Finally, we have Mirage, who we mostly talked about already in Nyx's section. Mirage's passive is just good maneuvers, good parkour. She slides a lot further, and her acrobatic maneuvers, quote unquote, are 50% faster. In practice, this is pretty similar to Nyx's passive bullet jump velocity and to another frame that we'll get to in B tier. Which means that she can bullet jump further. You know, she has better parkour. Sliding is relevant to racing. Sliding longer is not so good. What you really want is friction, but you can see that Mirage doesn't lose speed as quickly when she slides, which is good. And she also rolls more quickly, which is kind of relevant. It makes you build momentum a little bit faster. That's cool. But the main thing is those bullet jumps. So what we're going to do is show I have a bullet jump mod on. You see I have lightning dash, and we also have 2 Arcane Consequence, so we're going to spawn some enemies. And I'm just going to quickly get a headshot. And then we're going to, wow. You can, yeah. It's some height, right? Like once we get to this point, you start seeing some crazy stuff. So yeah, I mean, yes, you can bullet jump very, very far. But ultimately, again, it's not always the best to be able to bullet jump really, 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 really far. Wow, every time I'm impressed. It's just so far. But again, sometimes you want to use bullet jumps to move vertically, like very precisely, and you way overshoot things. You see jumping up there as smoothly as I have been with the other frames that have less bullet jump velocity. Not so smooth when you have this much. Even without Arcane Consequence, you can see pretty fast bullet jumps, nowhere near as high as with both sets activated, but you can see it's pretty far. You know, she can get moving pretty good, just like her fundamentals are very strong. And definitely that slide is alright. What we'd really want is less friction, because that's what's going to make you build speed a little bit more. The slide is basically letting you maintain it for longer, near as I can tell. So again, every possible bit of speed is good. It does add up, but Mirage doesn't necessarily have way more. Parkour is definitely one of the 3 main ways to get fast, besides just running on the ground with natural sprint speed or using dashes. So Mirage has that, but that doesn't quite cut it in B tier, where I finally get to introduce the real racing titans. Starting with Titania. I'm sorry, I had to. So she's got that parkour velocity that Mirage has. She doesn't have as much, and she also has a little bit of a drawback. She doesn't have that increased maneuver velocity as well. So her drawback is that she can give it to your opponents. This cloud can be claimed by allies, your opponents, during racing, and potentially give them the bullet jump velocity that you're benefiting from, which is not so good. You can see here we have Tellus Boltace, the bullet jump passive that is affecting me all the time, and then lightning dash, just like before, and you can see we do bullet jump a comparable amount. It's very similar to what Mirage had. If it's different at all, you can't really tell, which is good. So Titania has faster bullet jumps, that's cool. But the real ace in the hole is Razorwing Blitz. Razorwing Blitz scales with strength and stacks with itself 4 times for truly ridiculous, unsurpassed speed if you can set it up while you're in her 4th ability. So what we're going to do is try to actually activate it without running out of energy, and you're going to see that there's a bit of a problem. So we're dust, 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 and dust. And now we have the full buff, and as you can see, we go pretty fast. If you can control this, this is really fast. You definitely have to build up momentum. It's not all right there, but if you want to Jedi Starfighter your way through missions, like this is, you can do it. It's not literally motion sickness inducing, but okay. If you have a big straight area in front of you and you can get this buff going, you have pretty much won at least that part of the race, but you are very, very vulnerable to running out of gas, even if an ideal situation for using this kind of speed comes up again. You probably just won't have enough energy. Titania is kind of the dark horse of the higher tiers. She's definitely the worst of the group most of the time, but she has the potential to be the fastest of all if you can actually pull this off. It does take basically your entire build to be able to cast the 4 abilities you need to stack up fast enough to make them not cost way too much energy, to make it actually make you go fast, and to make it last long enough to be worth setting up in the first place. But it's still really, really, really fast if you set it up. And again, there are some more open areas, and with enough practice, you could pilot through some tighter areas, I suppose. Titania really is one of those frames, though, that's kept under control by the inability to spam energy pads and use energizing dash and stuff. She is pretty track dependent, and not every track is going to give her the space to use that speed. Titania's Razorwing Blitz is new since I last ranked her, and I think it puts her ahead of the other bullet jumpers, giving her the ace in the hole to compete at a higher level. Octavia, one of our stronger runners. If you can maintain her Vivace speed buff and keep getting it without messing up your racing, you can get going pretty fast, and although the buff can be snagged by your opponents, they'll have to match your rhythm while keeping up with you and attempting to pass you with this level of speed, which is pretty unlikely, so you're pretty safe overall. The biggest challenge is trying to maintain it yourself, but with practice and with plenty of time to set it up at the start of the race, keeping in mind that your opponents could grab it too, that shouldn't be prohibitive. Forgive me if I can't demonstrate more. Remember that I'm talking about what you could do with Octavia, not what I can do with her, because I totally can't. Hydroid has some pretty ridiculous dash range that scales with his duration. You stay in his wave for a set amount of time, and while you're in his wave, you go at a set speed that is modifiable by duration. So you'll go faster for the amount of time you're in the wave based on how much duration you have. And as you can see, you not only aren't affected by gravity, but you kind of go up a tiny little bit, which is nice if you want to boop around like this, although maybe not so helpful in a race. But you also can't dash laterally. Of course, I can't dash up. I will go way, way sideways. And let's get back there. Hydroid plays kind of like Titania's Razorwing Blitz, but he's much easier to set up, obviously. You can just hit the button, and he's a lot more fuel efficient. He doesn't have to cast 4 other abilities to get the full speed, but he offers much less control. You can't steer the wave. He's strongest when you know the map, and you can hurl yourself through a door into a huge straight, and it's absolutely useless in most other situations. As long as the track is on his side though, Hydroid is really consistently good when he's good. Still, I took Hydroid down a tier since last time. I mentioned with Rhino that dashes were overvalued in general in the last tier list, and I wasn't overestimating Hydroid in general. I happened to race quite a lot with Hydroid around that time. I just didn't appreciate how situationally he was contending against skilled A-tier opponents, and how biased my memory of his more powerful moments was. When Hydroid's wave is good, it feels awesome, and it's very easy to privilege that kind of memory. Like, that just, it looks ridiculous. It looks so strong, and it's actually not that much faster than a lot of other abilities, but it's so strong feeling that sometimes it just feels dominant, and it can maybe even be a little demoralizing to just see a Hydroid wave past you, because it looks so fast. It looks so fluid, too. So anyway, I think I overvalued him a little bit. I think exactly what I did was I privileged the memories of those awesome moments. He's more like an A tier frame and a C tier frame combined. You know, when he's running, he's a C tier frame. So I think B tier is more appropriate overall without opening the can of worms about track specific frames too much. By contrast, our other B tier dasher, Excalibur, goes pretty far for a reasonable energy cost and suffers only very short animation delay between each use. So he's much more conducive to spamming, and he'd be even more dominant if not for his enemy lock-on when he's dashing through enemies. If you have a lot of headroom, you can just jump over the enemies and then dash, but in tight hallways, which, you know, spoiler alert, there are a lot of those in Warframe, you're going to spend way too much time dashing from enemy to enemy. You even slow down. It'd be one thing if you had this whole crazy velocity that you've been seeing while dashing between enemies. That would actually be really cool, but you don't. You see, this is like super really going for it, and this is like, it takes forever. It's so slow. So if you lock onto a target, it almost makes you lose as Excalibur, and unless you get really used to where that lock-on cone is, that's not a good thing. But otherwise, he's a pretty good time, and he's the most commonly owned frame, which makes racing a little more accessible, kind of like the first frame in A tier, who is, of course, Volt, who's a great way to start off the 5 frames at the top of my tier list because he's so obvious, and right away using speed with full mods just completely blows most of what else we've shown during this video out of the water. It's crazy, like truly just unsurpassed speed, or so you would think, but Volt actually has some interesting balancing factors at play, which are really the only thing there is to talk about. Volt's problem is that he risks buffing opponents. So you want negative range, you kind of want negative range anyway to make the buffs last a while, and that does take up a slot, but ultimately you would want duration anyway. And essentially the rest of A tier is comprised of different ways to get speed comparable to Volt's, without risking giving it to your other opponents as much. So continuing with the speed buffs, we have Zephyr with her Jetstream augment for turbulence. It's not so much those dashes, although Tailwind is sometimes useful, but with Jetstream, she's just a tiny bit slower than Volt, and with longer duration and a trade-off on how easy it is for opponents to get her buff, she is worth using. You won't notice too much of a difference between Volt's speed and Zephyr's. Once I'm running at full speed like this, it looks about the same. It's still really, really, really fast. So Zephyr's trade-off is mostly that if enemies are standing near her right now when she has the buff active, they will go faster as well. But unlike with Volt, they don't ever have the chance to get the whole duration of the buff and just take off with it. The advantage here is that if people pull too far ahead of Zephyr, they lose her speed buff. Whereas Volt, just being near a Volt doesn't guarantee you the whole duration, but if you do get the whole duration, you can just take off and leave the Volt behind. Whereas Zephyr, while she might give the buff to her opponents, she's going to take it away as soon as they get out of her range. And her range is pretty small. With narrow-minded, it's not, you know, it's still very difficult for people to get the buff. But if they really hug you, and there are frames that can do that, then it is still something to worry about. And as I mentioned before, Tailwind still lets you reposition. This is really fast. It's pretty comparable to Excalibur's slash dashes. Actually, the biggest difference is that you just have a little bit less control because there's some, it happens more slowly. And as you fly around with it, it's just a little bit more sticky, but it's still fast. There are situations where this will be wicked fast. This is a pretty good example of why Hydroid is not in A tier when you have Zephyr who can be faster away other than that, also having that ability. So Zephyr's got a lot of stuff. Her floaty passive is also kind of a trade-off. Sometimes it lets you maneuver in midair in ways that are really nice, and sometimes it makes you maneuver in midair in ways that are not that nice. One good way to deal with Zephyr's floatiness is to bullet jump downward a bit more often. Bullet jumping down is something that is pretty helpful in racing in general. It just allows you to direct your descent a little bit, and Zephyr can really use that a lot. Without hitting the ground really slowly, she's still able to sort of control her descent and get down there a bit quicker than before, kind of negating her floaty passive. So I don't really think it's a disadvantage, and there are times where it will allow you to maintain momentum in a way that's really smooth and easy. So sometimes hopping over stuff, it can be an advantage too. It's mostly a trade-off. So Zephyr and Volt, the two main purveyors of speed buffs in A tier. Saren is the Hoarder. Using her Molt ability gives her the same speed increase as Volt, but only for a short time, and also at a significantly higher cost. You're literally paying double to be a Volt that doesn't have to worry about people stealing the buff, which is to say That's really good, and maybe you should do that. If you don't want to metagame, Saren is probably the way to go. She basically is just really, really fast, but she can have some serious problems in longer races where she will usually run out of gas due to Molt's high-ish cost and low buff duration. I think Prime Flow would be an interesting choice as a fuel tank expansion if you could somehow find space for it, but as you can see, even after only a few Molts, I'm running a little bit low on energy, and like this is very, very fast. It's not that short, it's over 10 seconds with this duration, but it's still, you know, you're running a bit low, so I was able to do 4 or 5, and now I'm out, unless I get a little more energy. Of course, you will occasionally get the orb here and there, so you probably top yourself off a little bit, but again, it's not too much. So you are going to get long buff duration, but not crazy long, 13 seconds, and the speed multiplier is literally the same as Volts. It's really, really fast. So as you can see, definitely a respectable option. There isn't a reason you need Narrow-Minded's negative range here, but you still want the duration because the buff is so short. This is actually a case where Saren needs to slow herself down because she needs the duration so badly for it to be efficient. So again, you could possibly fiddle with this by running, instead of Augur Message, you could run Prime Flow, or you could just run more strength here and just hope the race is really short. There are tracks that are shorter, so if that was a thing you wanted to do, you know, you could fiddle. And that Primed Flow fuel tank expansion thing is one of Saren's footnotes. She's one of the only frames that you might want to switch your mods depending on what track you are on. There isn't really a lot of reason to do that for most other frames, but if you know that the track is short or the possible tracks on that node are short, then you might want to quickly swap out some mods. That is allowed, it's just not, there's no reason to do that for most other frames, but Saren can get a pretty big benefit there. Let's continue the hype train for Saren by giving her special mention as the frame that changed the most since my last tier list. She went way, way up, from F tier all the way to A tier, pretty much as far as you can go without breaking racing as a competitive endeavor and earning a universal ban. She has Volt level speed on her Molt. Enough said. Huge change that really snuck in there, literally went from being essentially useless for racing to being one of the fastest frames in the game, arguably the fastest frame in the game in isolation. But she's got nothing on Nezha when it comes to butt scoots. Nezha's strength comes from his friction reduction passive, and a modest speed buff from Firewalker that doesn't scale with strength but has a pretty respectable base value. Since most of Nezha's speed is sliding and doesn't cost any energy while scaling very well with other speeds, mods, and buffs, Nezha is great for longer tracks, kind of the opposite of Saren, where he doesn't need to worry about running out of fuel at all, and he's overall just very consistent. The sliding thing does take a lot of getting used to, though, if you haven't played him before. I normally play Nezha with slide and friction reduction, so it feels alright to me, but overall, you know, he is very fast, and he teaches you to do the slide butt scoots, and he's just very consistent. This is the frame that if the tracks go really, really long, like if there was an infinite expanse of racetrack, Nezha would probably eventually win because everybody else would run out of gas. And he's still pretty fast. Again, you also kind of control the speed a little bit. Nezha, because of his slide increasing his speed, can kind of throttle back the speed. You see when I'm on these corners, I'm able to sort of not butt scoot, and then I slow down. And then when I want the speed, I just hit crouch for a sec and I go faster. So really a car in the truest sense of it. Nezha is a really unique racing experience. He's just passively quite fast, and he's able to take advantage of the limits imposed during races very well. He's weird, but he's a really good pick. And Nezha is also pretty much the only member of A tier that is able to use all of his mod space for whatever he wants. I feel like you can squeeze in a bullet jump mod here pretty easily while still running all of the sprint speed mods and all of the friction reduction slide mods, which is pretty good. You even have some extra space for whatever. But nobody's quite like Loki. Yeah, you could just swap with the person ahead of you, and sure, you don't maintain momentum, but you can teleport yourself forward and someone else back at the same time. Like, what more do you really want? You do come to a complete stop when you teleport, unlike a certain band member of S tier, so you can't maintain momentum like that. Same problem that Ashe has to some degree, and you do need a target, but you can make your own, so in many ways you're just in a better place than Ashe is already. So with the right reflexes and aim, Loki's pretty fast just by using this method. You could just boop. Like Ashe, Loki also has a really high base sprint speed, even higher than Ashe's, which means he can hold his own even without the teleports. despite the fact that Loki's are stronger anyway. He can kind of just run on the ground, and you can see compared to Nezha, who we saw before, Loki also has a lot of modding freedom, so we have very similar mods. Besides Nezha's slide passive, we have the normal slide mods and the sprint mods and stuff, and you can see you're pretty fast. Like, definitely not as fast as some of the sprinters with their speed buffs, but you're fast, and you have the ability to teleport. Like, you also have teleports. You don't even need to be that fast. You do need to get your clones on solid terrain. Because Loki's swap puts enemies literally behind him, your opponents with their speed buffs must pass you one way or another, so he kind of avoids the problem that Ashe has, where if you don't steal a speed buff, maybe you're just going to be slower, and you're kind of counting on people to make a mistake. With Loki, you make them make a mistake by putting them behind you, and they must pass you. This means that they have no choice but to play the minigame of whether or not they refresh the buff or not when they go by you, and again, most of the time I think people are going to want to, but if they do, you have faster base sprint speed. You're pretty much going to win outright if you get a Volt speed buff. So that was A tier, and I hope by now you get why Nova, with her instantaneous teleports that allow you to maintain momentum, is just too good. Since she can travel to just about any point in space as fast as you can think to go there, provided she has enough energy, and has just about her entire build free to get that energy, she's not even slow, her running speed is also really fast. Nova is unbeatable on paper. All things being equal, a skilled pilot playing Nova is going to be able to beat anybody else every single time. Wear the band with pride, Nova, because I'm not lifting it anytime soon. I mentioned earlier that operators are also banned. It wouldn't be impossible to have a fun meta with operators, but they don't make racing more interesting because they invalidate the dash frames like Excalibur, while simultaneously introducing a focus grind to competitive racing. Yeah, no thanks. Again, this is a kind of ban that was put more there not because it's impossible to make operators balanced or have a competitive format where operators are included, but just that it doesn't make it more fun. It's just not in service of anything to allow operators. It doesn't make it more diverse or make the competition more interesting or robust. So there really isn't a reason to include them if they're not automatic. You know, if you don't automatically get all the focus, which you absolutely don't, then there isn't really much to gain by including them. So I've decided to leave them out. If you need to enforce this ban, you can do things like run Vazarin, have people run Vazarin, and then you can see how many automatic revives they have in the squad, and then you can confirm that they have that, and then if you just leave the mission and go back in, if you see anyone with those revives, then you'd know that they'd used operators. I don't really feel the need to enforce this, but if your group of players feels like they need to enforce it, that's a way you can do it. It doesn't do a whole lot because then you are introducing a focus grind, but anyway, you know, you get the idea. And as we're closing up here, this is your quick reminder that the goal of good bannings should be to make racing more fun. If one option is just the best and there's no interesting decisions to be made, that's not as fun as if there were more options, and that's why I decided on those bannings. There are other balancing styles, but for this free-for-all racing format, I chose to do it like this, and that applies to just about all balancing decisions for games and gameplay formats. I hope you find mine compelling. DriftFrame has been a lot of fun so far, and I'm excited to bomb through submissions with all of you. I've been Zandy, and you're ready to race. Check out those supplementary materials I mentioned in the beginning of the video, and I'll catch you all on one of my streams sometime for some racing or just whatever other questions or thoughts you might have. I've attached my Twitch channel if you're interested. Catch you on the other side, folks.